Thank you everyone for joining again. For those who came last night, thanks for coming back. For those who are just joining us for the first time, thanks for coming and sparing some of your time on a weeknight to talk about Tuggerah Lakes and the report that we've delivered. This follows a process where we submitted, well, we were asked to join a expert panel. I was asked to chair a panel, and then I was asked to form a panel of experts. So we chose the best experts we had in the state. They were independent, and we got everyone together and looked at how we could address the main issues around Tuggerah Lakes. Doing so, we then, as I hope many of you be aware, we went out to the community. Of course, during COVID is always challenging, but we did get a lot of feedback. And a lot of that feedback helps drive where we spent the majority of our time doing this work. And that really got broken down in the end to the working with the community, which Stuart led, working on the catchment and the catchment work that we spoke about last night with Nicole, and the entrance, which we'll speak about tonight, led by David Wainwright, who's here today. And then tomorrow, the final focus was the water quality itself. So apologies for those who heard this last night, but the aim for the conversations we're having here is really to try to make sure that if there are any questions about our report, that we can get that feedback back to us. There was some really good feedback last night. And to also let people know where we're at and to try to close some of the loop of, we went out, we asked you how we tried to take that on board for what we did, and then what we did in the report to respond to that. So I'm the chair, Stuart's going to facilitate for tonight, and you're a really big part of tonight and how this all goes. So we are, as an expert panel, no longer formed. We ceased to exist, if you will, the day that we submitted our report, which was back in December 31st. And this, from this point forward, we have been like you, advocating for change and advocating for our recommendations to be taken up. But we felt it's really important to come back together and have this conversation. So happy to open the discussion tonight. And I'd maybe just add that, so my background, I am a professor at the University of New South Wales. I spend my life, I spent the last 25 years studying estuaries. I lead a research team in engineering and focused on estuarine engineering, estuarine water quality and water quality dynamics, hydrodynamics, hydrology, and looking at how these systems work now, how they have in the past, and how they continue to operate in the future. And I've done a number of these projects looking at systems just like this. And then again, of course, in Tuggerah Lakes, I've had some experience. So with that, I'll hand back over to Stuart, and we'll start the festivities tonight.
I might introduce myself. I'm a coastal engineer. So I'm trained as a civil engineer, and to become a coastal engineer, traditionally you do postgraduate. I've got a PhD in coastal engineering. And I've been working for about 25 years, most of that as a consultant. And I do a lot of stuff in estuaries that overlaps with Will's skill set as well. But one of the things that I do focus heavily on, and my PhD was on, is coastal entrances. So in coastal engineering, funnily enough, we're working a lot with the way that water interacts with pieces of soil now, or rocks. And that's a lot of the focus of what I'm talking about tonight. My key interest was how does sand move about in the entrance, and how does it affect the way that waters get in and out of the lake? And so that's my key area of interest. Now, there's an underpinning question that we're looking at answering as part of this, and it's a collaborative effort between myself and some of the people like Angus, who's going to be speaking tomorrow night. And that's, are there changes that we can make that will effectively improve water quality, like have a significant effect, so much so that it'd be cost effective to implement those actions. As I said, I'm interested a lot in the entrance, the overall effect of flushing, and also mixing of water in between the different lakes. So this lake system, as everybody here should know, 3 systems from south to north. That's Tuggerah, Budgie Way and Munmora. Now, Stuart mentioned the word research when he was introducing. We didn't so much do research. Our effort was mainly a peer review. That's the way that I saw it. As part of that, you have to assess all of the information that's out there, look at all of the studies that have been done. So we didn't do new modelling. I did little bits of analysis here and there just to check up the numbers of what I was seeing coming out of other people's work to see how I felt about it. But we didn't so much do new studies, new research. We weren't developing new information. Now, we dug back historically. I'm pretty fastidious about a lot of this stuff. The first detailed, technical, more or less modern piece of work that was done on Tuggerah Lakes is back in 1970. So there was a large study that was done during the 1970s. It was delivered in 1979. There's a long intergovernmental panel or something, the first of a long list of different panels that have looked at this system. But that's not to say that we haven't considered stuff that's even more historical. So I think there'd be a number of people here that are familiar with the book Tuggerah Lakes, way back when. That's something that many of the panel members had a good look through. I certainly did. Had a look to see what people had said about the entrance in the past. And so we've got compilations of historical accounts going back to the late 1800s. You know, old reports from fisheries inspectors and that sort of thing that are fairly enlightening. The other thing, and this is where the experience and expertise comes in, is we had a good look at what other systems are in the States. Similar, we're really looking at comparing apples with apples here. So some people might say, oh, well, why can't we just train it? Because, you know, it does such a good job at the Brunswick River. Or, you know, Port Stephens is really nice and clean. Why can't this be nice and clean? This is fundamentally a different system than those two systems. We are looking at a shallow lake. Now, people will argue about whether you're going to call it a lake or a lagoon. In my point of view, I don't care. It's a shallow water body that's fairly extensive. To me, it's most similar to Lake Illarra when I think about the systems that are present in New South Wales. Other similar systems are Lake Macquarrie. It's a bit deeper, it's trained. And, you know, then there's other things like other ones like Wallace Lakes that are the kind of similar type of size, same sort of environment, tides and waves that they're exposed to. So we have to consider that behaviour too and see what's happened with those systems after they've been trained, for example. So, as I said, I'm an engineer. Our terms of reference, from what I remember, was science focused. So engineering is very much an applied science. As a couple of our guests here tonight mentioned, we're all about solving problems and getting things done, providing answers, not just looking at information and working out new knowledge for new knowledge's sake. We actually want to provide stuff that's useful. And it was mentioned that we get a bad rap because sometimes engineers do things that are less useful than they should be. And when you're working in civil engineering and coastal entrances, big environmental systems like lakes, such as this, the potential to do irreversible damage is definitely there. Okay. Importantly, and perhaps it's something that really has to be considered aside, and it's a bit of a limitation of the work that we've done. We didn't focus on flooding. I've got a fair amount of expertise in flooding and the way floods are managed in New South Wales. It comes par of the course when you're talking about coastal entrances. So I've snuck in a little bit about flooding there, but we have to realise, and I don't want to preempt a study that's being done in parallel or almost in parallel on behalf of council at the moment by Manly Hydraulics Laboratory, which is looking at different ways of managing flooding and how the entrance might be managed. So the stuff that we've done, we can't sort of manage this entrance for a single issue like water quality, even though that is what we have been asked to look at water quality. When a decision is made about it, other things have to be considered. We've got to consider flooding. We've got to consider things like tourism. Okay, that was not within our terms of reference. So we're dealing with the issue of water quality. These are the key findings. I've got 2 slides of key findings. Enjoy. Tuggerah Lakes is a system that is naturally opened and closed, like many shallow lakes in the New South Wales coast. Naturally, they are what we call ICOLs, for want of a better acronym. ICOL stands for intermittently closed or open lake or lagoon. So it's trying to cover all bases there. It's a fairly large ICOL compared to a lot that we have on the New South Wales coast. There are 4 much smaller ICOLs to the south of here in the old Gosford LGA, Wamberal, Avoca, Cochrane and Terrigal. They're kind of a different beast in this. They close much more frequently when they're left to their own devices. This system probably closed completely around 10 times in the 100 years between 1880 and 1980. So definitely closed, but its tendency is to be open the majority of the time. And that's when it's open, it has a tendency, which has definitely the last couple of years has bucked the trend with this, because it's been relatively wide open with an entrance flowing out through the center of the bar at right at the entrance to the ocean. But during normal times, there's a tendency for the spit on the northern side. We can just see it. I don't know if you can see my screen. You can just see it over on the right-hand side of this image to grow south and constrain the channel right against the southern side of Karagi Point. Now, during normal times as well, and this is definitely shown in this figure, there is a disconnect around the fringe of the lake, particularly you see Tuggerah Lake here, where the water in the middle is not mixing with the water around the sides. And that is something which, you know, my esteemed colleagues, which will probably talk about this more tomorrow night, has to do with the barrier of vegetation that develops here. The water is kept fairly stagnant around the outside of the lake here when that barrier is strong enough, and that happens quite regularly, but you can get conditions like wind or a big flood can actually overcome it, and that breaks down. And then you get nicer mixing inside the near shore. It becomes a real problem if you've got, for example, stormwater discharging right into that area, because stormwater contains a lot of nasties. And if they are trapped in that area and they don't get to go where, you can end up with a situation that is fairly putrid. As I was saying, you know, winds can actually clear some of this stuff away. Catchment floods also have the ability to lift up some of the detritus that's around the outside of the lake, and waves can push it up a lot on adjacent to the shoreline, so you can get a deposition of what we call rack around the outsides of the lake. The ideal is that that rack is able to wash up onto the foreshore and dry out, but unfortunately it doesn't happen around a lot of areas of the lake. They've modified some of the foreshores, and that has caused a few problems in some locations. Again, this is not my area of expertise, but I'll give you a bit of a you know, precursor to what might be spoken about tomorrow night. Mixing between the lakes, so the gap at Tukley, and the one between Munmora and Budgie Way to the north of the Budgie Way sandmass, that's quite limited. So they're narrow gaps, particularly between Munmora and Budgie Way. That gap between Munmora and Budgie Way is quite constrained. It was dredged in the 1960s when the Munmora power station was put in. That was to allow the circulating flow. You know, you've got an intake for the power station and an outlet, and that actually the intake was from Munmore and the outlet was into Budgie Way. So there needed to be a way of balancing that flow, and they dredged a channel through there so that the flow could move more effectively. Talking of the Budgie Way sand mass, the information we have from studies that have been done by coastal geomorphologists, which is another specialty that we deal with a lot as coastal engineers, is that that big sand mass is what we call an old tidal delta, and there was once an entrance directly to the ocean from Budgie Way Lake. There's a bit written in the report about that and where it might have sat and that type of thing that people can read about if they're interested. But all of the information points to that not having been the case for the last 1500 to 2000 years. This is a direct, open, continuously open entrance between the ocean and Budgie Way Lake. There are plenty of sort of eyewitness accounts that we've come up against that have said that from time to time, particularly say in the first half of last century, there was overtopping waves over the barrier between the ocean at Budgie Way Lake. So that's something that has happened, but as the best knowledge that we can get is there has not been a permanent entrance that could be sustained for a long period of time for the last 1500 to 2000 years. Okay, getting right down to business. A lot of people have looked at training the entrance in the last 40 years. The report
can I just interrupt there by training the entrance? Some of us, myself included, aren't always clear about what that means.
So training the entrance has to do with building breakwaters. Okay, so most effectively you do it with twin breakwaters, one on each side. In New South Wales, the classic approach has been to build those two walls between 100 and 150 metres apart. The spacing between the breakwaters is very important. You need to make sure that when the tide is ebbing, so when the tide is flowing out of the lake, it's strong enough to clear sand from the entrance. Otherwise, sand obviously can move back in and it will clog up again. So there are constraints on how wide you can put training walls apart. Combined with training, you'll often have internal walls which join to the breakwaters, and strictly speaking, they are called training walls. So these are present, say, if you know the system to the north, if you know what Lake Macquarie is like, there are two breakwaters at Lake Macquarie, and inside the Blacksmith's breakwater, which is the northern one, there is a long training wall that stretches between there and the bridge at Swansea. So that's what the idea of training is. The intention is to make sure that you keep the channel at a particular location and that the channel remains clear of sand and doesn't shallow up. Training entrances to ike holes is really problematic, particularly these large ones. Okay, and many studies have looked into this. Some of them have been modelling studies. Well, most of them have actually had some aspect of modelling. Some of them have been based on what has happened in other locations. What's our experience like in New South Wales? Some of them have included dredging. So we've looked at training and also dredging. So if we dredge to -2.5 metres, this is what the impact's going to be. If we dredge to -3, if we dredge to -6, so that's 6 metres below mean sea level, what's the impact going to be? The people that have written these reads like a who's who of coastal engineers that have been in practice in New South Wales over the last 30 to 40 years. Now, overwhelmingly, and it's not 100% everybody saying the same thing, but there is an overwhelming tendency in these reports to say no. The reason is the reasons they give is that it's expensive. The positive impacts that people talk about in terms of getting better tidal exchange and therefore better mixing of water quality are not really there. So we might be looking at increasing from, say, 1 to 2% of the exchange on each tidal cycle to 3 to 4%, and doubling it compared with the volume that is actually moving in and out of the entrance compared to what actually flows into the catchment into the lake from the catchment, it's much smaller than that. So it indicates that the most important thing that is balancing water here in this system is what's flowing in from the catchment. Even if we doubled the exchange that's coming in from the ocean in normal times, it's not going to have that big an impact on the overall mixing. The other thing is that negative impacts are quite poorly understood. And really, it's only in the last, say, 15 to 20 years that we have seen the long-term impacts of training of systems like Wallace Lake. That's not entirely true. We've known about problems at Lake Macquarrie for a long time. Lake Macquarrie has a long history of sediment moving, foreshores eroding, that sort of thing. So there's a real concern that we're going to enter into a system of runaway scour. The most recent system that has been trained along the New South Wales coast is Lake Illarra. Very similar reasons that are being put forward here for potentially training Tuggerah Lakes. And that is that they had an issue with weed. They thought there was an issue with water quality, and if they trained the entrance, that it would resolve those problems. Now, what they have measured is that the water quality response is not large except in the immediate vicinity of the entrance. So there has been an improvement around, this is in Lake Illarra, there has been an improvement in the immediate entrance channel. You get clearer water, people appreciate that. So there is a socio-economic benefit. But when we're talking about pure water quality, say when scientists talk about water quality and the ecological benefits, clarity is not necessarily that important for us. So we have to realize, if we're going to go forward with something like training, we have to realize that those benefits are clarity. It's the way that it looks. It's an aesthetic benefit. Now, Lake Illarra is a really dramatic example. It's very similar to Tuggerah Lakes in terms of its shape and its size and its depth. You have a look at the entrance. If you jump on Google Earth or something, you will see how similar it looks in terms of the shape and the way that the shoreline is angled. The entrance channel is angled. And they are having tremendous problems there with runaway scour, undermining of caravan parks, loss of seagrass, activation of the channel with sand continuously moving upstream and depositing into the lake. This is what raises the largest concern in my mind about training this entrance.
Can you just, Dave, explain a little more about runaway scour? What exactly do you mean when you say that?
So runaway scour is when if you train the entrance and you open it up, it actually exposes the area inside the entrance to more tidal energy. Normally, a lot of the tide is lost. So there's some, you've got big tides in the ocean and small tides in the lake. Now, what happens is along the channel, that tide range gets what we call attenuated. It gets smaller and smaller. With systems like we have now here at Tuggerah Lakes, a lot of that loss occurs right at the entrance. So right where the sand barrier comes down, where it's constrained across the rock platform and that sort of thing. So if we remove that, the amount of attenuation of tide energy that you have at that location where the barrier is, then there's more tide energy that starts to impact further inside the entrance. What that means is that you get faster currents in and out. They start to move sand, and the dominant way it moves that is an upstream direction. So you start getting the channel deepening of its own accord without dredging in this case. And it also starts to meander backwards and forwards across the entrance. So it'll go northwards and southwards, and it starts to erode against the foreshores. And that is an ongoing problem at Lake Macquarie along Swansea Channel at the moment. Sand moving up, not only it interferes with navigation, so you've got this strange sort of scenario where you've got sand continually moving upstream, interfering with navigation, but at the same time it's eroding foreshores. So it's getting deeper and deeper and eroding some parts, but then there are areas that are shoaling. And that runaway scour issue is something that will potentially last hundreds of years and create problems for a long time into the future. The situation at Lake Macquarie, where the entrance breakwaters were built in the late 1880s, we are still seeing problems there that are very difficult to deal with. There was a marina that fell in there a few years ago. That is a result of the opening of the entrance and people not understanding that process. Very difficult to analyse and understand exactly what's going when it gets into that stage. Some people have spoken about potentially having a single breakwater, either on the southern side or the northern side of the entrance. Long story short is that that has a fairly poor record of being successful in New South Wales. There are examples, they actually tried to train Lake Illarra in the early 2000s with a single breakwater along the southern side. It closed within about a year. So they started to point the finger at the single breakwater as being a cause for the lake closing. And subsequently they had to build a second one. And now we've got the situation down there, which we hope to avoid here at Tuggerah, or at least I do. The other thing that we looked at, because I was talking about entrances to the ocean and that sort of thing, is the potential for a second entrance at Budgie Way. Now, as I said, we were undertaking a peer review of the studies that have been done in the past, and I found that in a lot of studies dating back to the 1970s, coming forward to 2010, there were often studies that said that they had modelled or analysed the issue of putting in a second entrance at Budgie Way. But in reality, I couldn't find any evidence that they had done much at all. And I find that a bit concerning. I do think that we need to look at that a bit closer so that we understand what the parameters are around that. I'm not necessarily saying that we can get something to work here. In fact, it'll certainly be a massive intervention into the system if we were going to try to do something. But I just find it a bit unacceptable that over so many years people have just sort of written it off without really giving it proper thought. So that's one of the recommendations that is actually going to be carried forward from, well, I hope. We'll see what happens. As Will said, we don't officially exist anymore. So in summary, these are the recommendations that have come out of the sectional entrances. The existing training and extensive dredging, like that's dredging over and above what council has been doing for the last 30 years. I don't recommend that be considered further. It has been analysed to death. Sorry, we might get new information or a better understanding or new techniques or technology that might help. Now that might make us think, well, yeah, we can look at it again. But for the time being, I don't think that there is much value in rehashing this. I know that people are a bit fatigued with studies on this. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to be saying, yeah, we need another study to look at this when we've had 6 or 7 that have already come up with an answer. Try to keep doing the same thing and expecting a different answer. I don't advocate that. This is there's an issue of tidal inundation hazard. Now this interacts with coastal legislation in New South Wales. There's the issue of tidal inundation and how much we're going to get around the fringes of the lake, and how that might change if and as sea levels rise. That is something that really needs to be grappled before we can even start talking about management of the entrance and increasing tidal ranges in the entrance, or increasing, if you open up an entrance, a second entrance, or you make an entrance bigger, then you start exposing areas around the fringes of the lake to higher tides. And that actually adds on top of the flood risk that is present around the fringes of the lake. So that has to be understood, and that's what the intention of this second recommendation is. The dredging that has gone on over the last, since 93, so we're looking at more than 25 years that they dredged the entrance. we're recommending that it continue in the short term. But the issue that I've found in talking to a number of people that have been involved in it historically is that it has become quite obscured what the reason for doing that dredging is. When we've looked at it, it appears that the largest benefit that you get out of dredging the entrance is that it actually lets some of the ocean water, the clearer ocean water, get in more easily to the area along the southern part, just inside the entrance. So where there's that focal area where people go and feed the pelicans and that sort of thing. So there's a scenic and an aesthetic benefit to that, and that may have value for tourism, for socioeconomic reasons, that it's definitely worthwhile having a look at so that we understand what the scale of those benefits might be. One of the first recommendations as part of number 3 that we considered was to install a water level recorder. That has happened. So the New South Wales government has installed a water level recorder for council just downstream of the bridge. Now with that, we're going to be able to much better have a look at how effective it is in increasing tides and getting clear water into that area downstream of the bridge. And as I said, socioeconomics, that's a suggestion as well. We need to understand how much value there is, whether it's of a benefit to the business in that area. Once that's done, then we need to have a good hard look at it and work out whether that dredging needs to continue. Is it worthwhile? Do we really understand why we're doing it? And do the benefits outweigh the costs? That's the long and short of it. Finally, and this is in response to seeming lack of detailed analysis of, formal analysis I'm talking about here from people, professional engineers and scientists that look into this sort of thing all the time. I think there needs to be a bit of an open-minded study into what can be done around the Budgie Way sand mass. And Council is in the process of developing a coastal management program, and that's something that, even though we as the expert panel have, we've aimed to do a lot of consultation to make sure that we understand what's going on and how people feel about things, that coastal management program also has to take that approach. So it's a genuine part of the coastal management program that there's a vision that's set that meets the needs of the community. And I think that as part of that, I would recommend that a study does look into what sort of options might be available around Budgie Way. And that's where I'm going to end, and I'm ready to take questions if you have any, Stuart.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, David. And I see that questions are coming into chat, so that's good. Keep those questions coming. I've got a summary here of things that have come in over the last few days and weeks. And again, I'll pick, try and capture all the sentiments in all of those. So there seems to be, I think I noticed this through the consultation process, and we'll jump in anytime as well, about what does an open entrance mean? What do we mean when we say an open entrance? And it seems that people have different ideas about that. Dave, I don't know if you've got an opinion about, is open, or is there some nuance around that? What does open mean to you? I mean, what does that question mean to you?
So naturally, this thing, I mean, open could mean anything. It could be anything from a 400-metre wide channel to the 35 or 25-metre wide channel against the southern side. So if everybody can see my slide there, we've got 2 examples of an entrance that is open. Mm-hmm. The one on the left-hand side is it's towards the, we're looking at very dry, drought-like conditions at the end of 2018. And the entrance berm has sort of gone right south to butt against that rock platform, which is a very common location for it to end up going to. But since the flood that happened in 2020, February 2020, since that flood, it's remained even, open and more located towards the centre of the channel here. So these are two examples of a naturally open channel. During floods, it's been reported that we can actually get a channel that's up to 400 metres wide, spread across the entrance here. Now, a permanently open entrance would be something that's trained. So often when we talk about opening up the entrance and we're talking about works that have to be taken on board to do that, we're talking about putting in breakwaters like I just described. And in New South Wales, they typically be somewhere between 100 and 150 metres apart. It can go even further. We can talk about dredging as well to open it up more. So yep, there's no absolute definition of open, but there are limitations on what we can do if we're going to intervene in this in an engineering manner. And I would say that that's it's about 100. The sweet spot might be about 120 metres between them.
All right, good, thanks. Other issues which emerged both through last year and more recently is questions about sea level rise, and it's not always obvious to people, to me, to others, about the connection between that and flooding in the lake. Now, I know we didn't look at flooding as a panel, but I just wondered if you could explain that connection a little more.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this harkens back to what I was talking about with flood risk. So let's forget about sea level rise for a second and talk about what happens when the entrance is open. When the entrance is open larger, and so what you do is you're more or less increasing the tidal range inside the lake itself. So most of the scenarios that have been looked at by previous researchers, various breakwaters, various configurations for dredging, they will result in a tidal range in the lake that is somewhere between, maybe 7 or 8 centimetres typically. When it's a situation like we've got on the left-hand side here, where its closure is almost imminent, you'd be lucky to get 2 centimetres of tide range inside the lake. Now, that extra 5 centimetres or whatever on top, sorry, not that much, it's 4 or 5 centimetres on top of the tide range on the high tide inside the lake actually exposes properties around the fringes of the lake to a higher flood risk. When we add that onto potential sea level rise, it's beyond potential now, it's happening. We don't know exactly when and how much, but it's happening. When you add that on top of sea level rise, it exacerbates the issue. So I have written in the report, I've spoken about how that you're basically adding sea level rise, and then you're giving people a double whammy by increasing the tide range inside the lakes.
Yeah, okay. So the bigger the entrance, the more the tidal flows can go in and out, and the bigger
That's
impact
right.
in the lake levels.
Yeah, it's not huge. It's only a few centimetres, but that can be significant to somebody whose property is very flat and low lying and is sitting around the fringes.
So I might just add in here, so there's a lot of discussion about the tide, and I want people to recognize that the tide is a very complicated thing, and David's making a lot of comments about moon to moon, and yes, there's difference between what we call spring and neap tides, and we do get spring tides when they form at the with the full moons, and we get neap tides in between. In fact, the tide is actually driven by many components, and we can do tidal constituent analysis, and that tells us all the things that drive the tide, and there's many things. But it's also important to know that in a big shallow lake like this, when you see the water going up and down, it's not because the ocean is rushing in and filling the water up. It's often because the ocean is creating a barrier, right? And the barrier, as the ocean levels go up, there's no way for the lake water to get out. So it builds up with it, right? But it's not water rushing in, filling the hole and completely filling the whole area in. It's that there's water coming into the lake and they rise together and then they fall together, right? And they rise together and fall together. And that process is often confusing because people see the lake rising and they think, oh, it must be from the ocean level rushing in and filling the whole lake up with water. And that's often just not the case. Right? And that's a very well-known and established process. So Dave, I look forward to changing my mind. We don't see anything particularly unique about the tides here. And this is what we look at quite a bit. So we have spent a lot of time looking at this.
Okay. And it's I might just come back to the figure, Dave Wainwright, of the 1 to 2% exchange currently. Again, I've seen over the past 12 months some questioning of that, and this seems to be, at least in part, behind the sense that if we opened up the channel, we would get more flushing and the water would be better. It's a perfectly understandable hypothesis, but I think what you're saying is it's a small amount of water. So how some people are questioning that 1 to 2%. How confident are we in the 1 to 2%? How well do we know that figure?
I'm very confident with that figure, actually. I mean, a lot of people have reported it, but it's quite an easy calculation once you know what the volume of the lake is, and other people have worked that out. And you just need to work out, just need to measure how much the lake's going up and down, and then understand what the surface area of the lake is. And that's, 1 to 2%. When you've got a tide range of about 3 centimetres inside Tuggerah Lakes, that's about a 1.5%. So 1 to 2% is pretty much on the money when it's, in this situation on the left-hand side here that I've got in these figures. When it's more open, you might get up to that 7.5, maybe up to 10 centimetres. This is the daily tide. I don't have access to the chat, but I imagine it's Dave Eaton that's talking about the fortnightly tides, spring neap cycle. That's a different thing again. And the thing is that one happens very gradually as well. It takes 14 days. So the important one is the one that's happening on twice a day. 1 or 2% of exchange.
So if you stop sharing your screen, you'll be able to follow the chat, and you can always reshare if we need to come back to your pictures. That might make life a little easier for you. All right, thanks. Have we found, again, people are saying it's sort of the same question, but in a different way, that if we dredge, that will improve water quality in the lakes. Have you, in your reviews of studies, was there anything supporting that? Is that something that's emerged?
So yeah, some of the big dredging examples that I looked at, well, I didn't look at them. I'm reporting on what other people have done, and the studies are generally robust. They're not perfect, but I believe the conclusions are pretty good. We might get an improvement of say 2 to 3 centimetres to something like 7.5 centimetres. It's around about it's about a doubling maybe of the tidal range inside the lake. Of course, that's more ocean water getting in. But when I've spoken to other people in the expert panel who deal with the issues around the outside of the fringes of the lake, that they're saying that's just not enough to really have a big impact on the problems that you see around the fringes of the lake.
Okay, all right, thank you. what about, 'cause the area has, there've been a couple of big floods just quite recently, and the timing for our review was quite interesting given what happened in February last year. And again, we didn't look at flooding; it wasn't really part of our gig. But is there anything more you can say, or perhaps Will, about this connection between what happens at the entrance and rain? Flooding from rain. Because it's obviously quite a dynamic system. Is there anything more we can say just about those dynamics? Because that's a point of contention for people out there, understandably. Floods are a problem.
I might field this first. So, I mean, what happens to the entrance when it rains and you get a large flood? The water gets held back in the lake because the entrance is a natural constraint. Over time, the entrance channel scours, it gets larger and it gets wider. Yeah, there are reported in the literature, I don't know how well this has been examined, that it can get to 300 and 400 to 400 meters wide. So almost spanning, a large distance across that entrance compartment. And of course, when it's more open, more tides can come in. But because, the ebb tides are quite weak, there is a tendency when the entrance is very wide like that for sand to wash back in. So we have this process where it's open after a flood, but typically, notwithstanding what's happened in the last couple of years, sand tends to wash back in very quickly. And you get this process where the entrance becomes constrained again. There's lots of shoals moving upstream. The tide currents weaken further, and the natural coastal processes will build that barrier so that it extends across the entrance down towards the southern end, which is what we see on the left-hand side here. And that's where we've got very sort of limited tides inside the lakes when it gets like that. That's the process that gets followed. It might close completely, as it has historically, in which case a flood is needed to break it out again.
Okay, Will, do you want to add anything to that?
I guess yeah. What Dave is talking about is the natural process of opening and closing of these lagoons that happens, on 70, 80 of the lagoons in New South Wales, constantly every season as we go open and closed. So it gets wet, it opens up, and then the ocean closes it. And this wouldn't matter if there was one entrance or two entrances. And when we've seen there's a second entrance, that robs Peter to pay Paul, right? So typically you look at somewhere like the Shoalhaven or the Manning, where we have occasionally two entrances. They're usually closed very quickly because they don't, there's no mechanism to keep them open. Because naturally the ocean wants to push sand into these entrances. Now, in terms of the flooding, the process is that yes, we can have a second entrance. The second entrance can be a little bit open, or we can get washover, and washover is a different thing than an open entrance. And I think that's one of the things we've been very careful of, that occasionally getting water washing over an entrance is different than having a big wide open entrance that encourages exchange. And then I guess the other thing is about flooding, right? So I think we've time and time again been told that this study did not look at explicitly how to manage for flooding. We have been looked at how we manage for water quality. So if there has an issue with why should you open up the entrance for water quality, we'd say, well, it's not going to make much of a difference for water quality. It may make a difference for water clarity. And water clarity may be enough for people to want to go ahead and open the entrance, but that's not water quality, right? The water quality can still be quite appropriate for an estuary. And so then the next case is, well, how do we deal with water quality? And the water quality, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, partly is driven by what's coming off the catchment, as we said last night, what's coming off the groundwater. And if we were to have a very large open entrance, the standing water level would fall, and that would bring more of the groundwater into the system. And so we're concerned that if we were to encourage more groundwater to come into the system, we'd need to have a way to manage more nutrients coming into the system as well. And so
There's a point. Can I just pick
these
up
are,
on a point
you
there,
can
Will?
see a cascade of issues. Yeah.
Yeah. Because people might have picked up that there's a, inconsistency with some stuff I've been saying before about higher tides getting higher. Okay, when you're talking about the standing water level there, you're talking about the mean water level inside the lake.
That's right.
And this just goes to the complexity. You think tides are really easy? Well, some people do. It can be incredibly complex.
It is, yeah.
So again, there's a bunch of questions coming in that are really water quality questions, and tomorrow night is the forum when we've got Angus on board, who's the person really to talk about that. I think, if I paraphrase and correct me if I'm wrong, that in terms of the entrance and water quality, there's not sufficient water coming in and out of an entrance, even were it to be trained, to make an enormous difference on water quality bottom line. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So
again, it's do we fix the end of the pipe, or do we try to fix the problem at the source? And that's what we were talking about last night was, if the source of the bad water quality that we're dealing with is coming from the catchment, well, we should attempt to address the problem. And that is something that can be fixed. That's something that should be addressed. And with the extra tens of thousands of houses coming in, something that should be a priority. Right? Something that we should focus on is that if they're going to build another 40,000 houses, we should make sure they're done well and that we don't keep adding to the problem, versus turning and focusing our attention on something that even if we spend $100 million on, we'll only get a small improvement, if any. And the many studies that Dave's looked at highlight that they don't really, aren't really going to make much of a difference.
In terms of water quality, yeah. And again, there's a bunch of questions coming in about flooding, and we specifically didn't really look at that in detail, did we? So it's a bit hard for us to respond to some of those.
I just say, Stuart, that my understanding is that we've got this parallel study going on with Manly Hydraulics Laboratory. They have access to our report. And I believe the Tidal Management Program, they'll be looking at bringing our work and the work that is being done in parallel together to develop an entrance management strategy that includes both water quality and flooding. I can't say for certain, but I think that might be the case. Yeah.
Let me just come to some of the other questions I've seen coming in on a slightly different topic, including about government response. Question to us, Will, is what has been the government's response to our recommendations so far? What have we heard? What do we know? We're probably best placed to answer that.
The government response has been that they accepted our report. That was the first task. They've accepted our report. They've taken the report on board. They did not alter in any way our report after we provided it to them. So the report that we provided was the report that was released. I'm aware from the information I've been given that the government are considering what their response will be. We hope that all of our recommendations are taken up. I understand that many of them fall naturally within the coastal management program that is underway now by council for the region. And so that some of these may be addressed by council, and we hope to hear from that as the process moves forward. And then ideally, once council has acknowledged what they will or will not plan to take on, then the state government will also do the same. I am, as a local citizen, also trying to encourage that to happen, and I'd encourage others to do the same. One of the things, the reason we're having this conversation tonight is so that we can explain what we were thinking and get it out there, so people will hopefully understand where we're coming from and then try to go the next step of encouraging change themselves. What we see that isn't working in this community has been a lot of people pointing fingers at each other, and the slinging matches that have happened that haven't led to really the outcome have been favorable for anybody. So what happens is when two people yell at each other, then they both go quiet and don't talk to each other, and that's exactly what we're trying to get over. And I understand the frustrations. We understand the frustrations, and that's why one of our recommendations, I think people be aware, was that we thought there was an opportunity to bring in a central party, and that that someone independent that could try to bring the groups together and get things moving in the right in the right way, in the right position, so that we could actually start having some change happen. And the final thing I'll say is that we're very aware that a huge burden has been placed on the council to do everything with the lake, with really no income to manage it. And so we've been encouraging and make recommendations in our report that the burden of trying to fund what's needed to be done in here has to be shared across government. And it really just can't, council just doesn't have the money to do what are the expectations by the community. And that doesn't seem to get any better anytime soon.
And hence, as we talked about last night, a couple of recommendations about stormwater levy and an environment levy, wasn't there? So as part of that picture. So Dave and Will, if there's any questions there that are jumping out at you, David, there's a question here which Tony's been asking about studying the Y on council days about a second channel, which I think is in the entrance zone. Not quite sure what that question means, but I don't know if that means anything to you. Did you ever come across anything about a study in those days that 1986, second channel being dredged? Any impact? Is that ringing any bells?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, so
I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. But there's limitations to what you can do, and if it's an old report that's buried in council archives, there's next to it won't get uncovered easily.
All right.
I might take, there's one here from Tony, and he makes a comment about at what point in time of the evolutionary journey does the expert panel wish to have the lakes maintained? And I'm not sure he's being facetious or not, but there is no point at which the lakes are maintained. The issue we have is private property, right? So the private property rights are what people are concerned about, and how those private property rights are impacted is what drives the flood study, right? These are the issues that become the governmental decision making. So yes, and 7,500 is one way to go. If you went 25,000 years back, they were 120 meters lower. So we're very aware of the geomorphology and the geology of the region, but I don't think any of us would want to maintain them at some geological point in history. What we want to do is have an adaptive system that works for as many as possible, and that is I guess not forced to be one way or the other, and just doesn't waste resources. So what is the best way for the system to be managed? And that's got to be an adaptive management it just seems to make sense for me. The dredging work that Dave talked about said, you may want to continue dredging, but at least talk to the community about why are you doing it? Why are you spending this money doing it? And let's have a goal for what you actually wanted to achieve. Yeah. And if it's not achieving that, why is the community paying for that money? So what is it? And let's have it. To me, that makes common sense, right? Someone's paying for that. Is it achieving what you want? And if not, let's have a chat about it.
Yeah, in my work, I've worked on a number of coastal systems like Macquarie and others, and they are the classic wicked problem, aren't they? They are complex systems, complex adaptive systems, and it's really challenging to find the answer to all of these questions, to any of these questions. They're full of trade-offs. And as you've pointed out, Dave, a solution such as training can be a problem in disguise, can't it, with future impacts. So they are really complex things. That's certainly my time on the panel. That's been obvious. They are really complex and challenging systems to manage, and there is no such thing as a simple answer to any of these things. Yeah.
I think I saw some comments last night about the level of understanding of the system, and the fact that we don't understand these things perfectly. And it's a bit of a two-edged sword, like how you can study it to death and stop getting any further, but you're just wasting money and not spending time trying to resolve the problems. And at some point, we've got to say, well, it's enough. We've got to accept that we're not going to understand these systems perfectly. We've got to use the best information that we've got and move forward with it. It's difficult. The science doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what you have to do. And again, I'll have to, this is what, engineers, this is what we're trained to actually balance, to try to pull all these things like economics and social stuff and physics, and whether we want to put in an engineered solution to solve a problem. I kind of see us as having a role of helping make decisions, to get the information together that helps to make decisions. I think most people would agree it's not desirable to just keep studying over and over and over again, study after study.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's part of the report, the recommendations I was making about working with the community on resolving some of these things, a more collaborative approach than perhaps has been visible to date. So learning together, finding out some answers together, and making stuff happen together is, I see, a key part of the future. Yeah.
But Stuart, I'll also add, so I've done something very similar to this project in the Shellhaven. They've got two entrances there. Shellhaven Heads community really wants that entrance open, and they felt well and truly that it should be open based on water quality. What they really wanted was it to be open on water clarity. So we looked at it, and the water quality was actually okay. Not dissimilar to the great expanse of the middle of the lake in Tuggerah. But the quality, the clarity is and was still not what they want for tourism. And so that's a different argument, right? If the community and the value of that makes sense, and you want to drive that, and we should spend $100 million because it brings in enough money to make it worthwhile, then that's a different argument than we should do it to make the water quality better. We would have concerns because there's a lot of unknowns by doing that, and like we've seen in Lake Illarra and other places. But you can just keep engineering, making more and more brick walls around the place. But for our points, the issue of the quality of the water is really focused on the edge, and that's what we should try to fix it.
And that's largely the ground we'll be covering tomorrow in tomorrow's forum. So if you're interested, join that one as well. So folks, I'm conscious of the time. We're sort of drawing to a close. I'm trying to find questions that we haven't sort of broadly covered without going to every question, because again, the ones that I'm flooding, we could sort of take them on notice, really, to an extent.
Stuart, I just clarify. So this article from '86 about a second channel was at the entrance. The way the question was posed before was suggesting, from what I understood, that it was up
right
in another lake. It was right. Two channels at the actual main entrance.
Yeah, right. Good.
Yeah.
Yes, and there's a last question there. Are people more concerned with the water's appearance or health of the lakes? I think it depends who you ask. That would be my sense. We got input on all of the above. So I don't think it's very hard to say more. All of these things are important to people. That would be my experience. Anything else, Dave or Will, that's leaping out at you is something we can usefully respond to? I think
I saw something pop up about 40,000 houses coming into the catchment. I think I'd like to highlight that. It's a really, really important thing that was, was spoken about a lot last night. And look, we've got an opportunity here, right, to make sure that we've got an opportunity to make sure that it's done right. Okay, so that these houses that go in and the way that it's subdivided and built has as little impact as possible on water quality in the lake. I mean, that's just, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's going to cost developers more money. That's the way it is. But there's got to be a way to do it that isn't going to, stuff the lake up for everybody else.
Gary agrees too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really wished we had the passion for an open entrance was the same as the passion for good quality water coming off the catchment. And there was a comment before about pulling water out of the system and the impacts of that. My understanding is that there is a range of water sharing plans being undertaken for coastal New South Wales. I've been involved in a few of them, and where they are looking at the impact of any of that happening, so that as water extraction and water licensing is being looked at, it's the biggest issue really in terms of what it's doing to the system is not so much in the flows, it's in the movement of salinity. So we can have salt water where we don't have oceanic water, because what happens is salt travels. Diffusion is what it's called. Salt travels to a low level concentration, and so salt will move up if there's no water pushing it out, if there's no advection pushing it out. And so we can get salt in places that wouldn't naturally have salt by removing some of the water upstream. And that's a big issue in estuaries. We've got a huge study looking at this in the Hunter right now because of that very issue. And so that to me is probably the one of the more important steps looking forward is how does that get looked at and analyzed, and that should then be setting the extraction limits and licenses.
Good, thanks. There's a question also, someone picked up on our recommendation for a task force, and what does that mean? What's our sense of the governance of, well, not just this ICOL, but others? Will, and I know you've kind of got some opinions about these things. So is there anything you want to add about that, how we might manage this system going forward?
Well, we were very explicit in our recommendations in the report. We said that we thought a panel, local type panel, something similar to what they had at Lake Macquarie, which from our consultation with many people, they were very happy with how that rolled out and what they achieved with that sort of a panel. Really a stopgap measure to try to draw a line in the sand, get people together, get a third party in there to get people talking, stop the yelling at each other, and start trying to work out with what does everyone really want to achieve here and what's feasible by doing so. And we've also were explicit in saying that we felt it should be funded by the state government. That the state government, it's temporary, it's only a short-term thing, but there are many of these. I think Wombrel has another one like it. And council doesn't have it, but the state government is the one who's saying we need to take 40,000 houses into the catchment. So I think there's a load sharing that it seems reasonable from where we sit that would make sense that they would fund that, and then that would also provide an independent party to look into the things that council's doing with their water sensitive urban design plans and their DCPs and local environmental plans, and make sure they're fit for purpose for what the community wants to achieve within the lake.
Thanks, Phil. So I don't know, folks, how are we traveling? It's 8:15. I definitely want us out of here in the next few minutes. So I might start to wrap up, and just want to say thanks for your time and input. And again, we've got one more tomorrow night, so you can find the recording of last night's on Facebook. We'll do the same here with your permission, unless I hear otherwise. That's our plan. Also, chat's recorded too, so if anyone wants a copy of that or any access to that, could make that happen. But otherwise, thanks for your interest tonight, and join us again tomorrow night. Will, do you want to add anything?
Just I guess a final thank you as well, Stuart. I mean, we are trying to explain some of the thoughts that we have in driving a 400+ page report in a short period of time. We, as I think we said last night, we've done this on our own accord, that we feel an obligation to do this, to explain what we've done. We're not government people, and so we're purely taking time out of our night to try to bring this thought together and explain what's in there. I will say that we have written a summary report. That's a short sort of 15-20 page document with lots of, so this is the 500-page report brought down to a few things. We're hoping to have that out very soon. But for people in this forum, I imagine you're probably interested in a lot of the details. So hope that was useful, and we'll be back here tomorrow night. Thanks again for coming.